My name is Diana Myers, and I am 28 years old. 5 minutes ago, I was just the chief financial officer of Myers and Associates, a commercial real estate firm with a portfolio valued at exactly $23.7 million, according to our last quarterly audit. Now, I am the woman holding the pen that will decide whether my parents spend their retirement in a luxury condo or a state-mandated assisted living facility. Sandra Myers, the woman who gave birth to me and then spent the next 2 decades trying to pretend she hadn't, hissed those words at me across a mahogany conference table that cost more than the 1998 Toyota Corolla she sold for scrap metal the day I turned 18. "You were never a daughter, Diana," she said, her voice cutting through the sterile, climate-controlled air of this 47th floor suite in the Wells Fargo Center. "You were a line item we couldn't afford." She was wearing a Chanel tweed jacket from the 2023 spring collection and a strand of Mikimoto pearls that I know for a fact were purchased with the dividends from the very accounts I managed. Her husband, my father, Marcus, sat beside her picking at a loose thread on his charcoal Ermenegildo Zegna suit, unable to look me in the eye. But I am getting ahead of myself. Now, let me take you back to a rainy Tuesday in October 15 years ago, on a sagging porch in southeast Portland, Oregon, where the world as I knew it ended and my real life began. I was 13 years old, and the only things I owned in the world were packed into 2 black Glad drawstring garbage bags that sat like slumped, pathetic shadows on the wet wood of our porch. The air smelled of damp cedar and the metallic tang of an approaching storm. My mother hadn't even looked at me when she shoved those bags through the door. She hadn't hugged me, hadn't cried, and certainly hadn't explained why my father was already idling his beat-up truck at the end of the driveway, his face a mask of cold indifference. "We can't keep doing this, Diana," she had told me through the screen door. "The math doesn't work. You're a debt we can't service anymore." At 13, I didn't understand accounting, but I understood the weight of being unwanted. I spent that night shivering on those bags, listening to the distant hum of traffic on Division Street, until my Aunt Elena pulled her rusted 2005 Subaru Outback into the curb at 3 in the morning. Elena was my father's sister, the black sheep who worked as a night shift bookkeeper for a construction firm and lived in a 1-bedroom apartment that always smelled of lavender laundry detergent and old ledgers. She took me in not because she was rich, but because she knew what it felt like to be a footnote in the Myers family history. For the next decade, while my parents were leveraging a modest inheritance into a predatory real estate empire, I was sitting at Elena's cramped kitchen table, learning the language of power, mathematics. Elena didn't just give me a home, she gave me a calculator, a Texas Instruments TI 84 Plus, and taught me that while people lie, numbers are the only thing in this universe that remain honest. I watched her struggle to pay the $412 monthly utility bill for her drafty apartment in the dead of winter. I watched her skip meals so I could have the latest edition of my AP Calculus textbook. My parents, meanwhile, were moving into a $4 million colonial in Lake Oswego, joining the Hunt Club, and making sure every local society column mentioned their philanthropic contributions to the arts. They never called. They never sent a birthday card. When I graduated from Portland State University with a double major in finance and accounting, the only person in the bleachers was Elena, her hands red from clapping so hard. I built my career in the shadows. I started as a junior analyst at a mid-market firm, working 80-hour weeks until my eyes burned from the blue light of triple monitor setups. I became an expert in forensic accounting, learning how to track every cent, every hidden offshore account, and every shell company used to mask a deficit. I was 25 when I saw the name Myers and Associates cross my desk. They were looking for a CFO, a heavy hitter who could navigate the treacherous waters of high-interest commercial loans and a crumbling retail portfolio. They didn't recognize the name Diana Myers on the digital application. To them, I was just a stellar resume with a ruthless reputation for trimming the fat. They didn't realize that I was the fat they had trimmed 15 years ago. When I walked into that first interview, my mother was sitting in the very chair she occupies now. She looked at me, her eyes scanning my $500 pinstripe suit and my leather briefcase, and she saw a tool. She didn't see the 13-year-old girl in the rain. "Your references are impeccable, Miss Myers," she had said, her voice dripping with the fake warmth she reserved for people she thought were her equals. "We need someone who isn't afraid to be cold." I had smiled, a sharp, practiced movement of my lips, and told her that cold was my specialty. For 3 years, I ran their empire. I saw the rot behind the marble foyers. I saw the $200,000 credit card debts Marcus racked up at casinos in Atlantic City. I saw the 6-figure wire transfers Sandra made to shady interior designers to kick back cash into her personal accounts. I managed their life, down to the last penny, waiting for the moment the market would shift and the debt would come due. That moment arrived this morning. The federal interest rates rose, the commercial leases in their downtown plaza expired without renewal, and the $30 million balloon payment on their primary loan became a ticking time bomb. They called this emergency meeting to ask me to find a way to hide the losses, to forge the projections, to save their reputation. But as I sit here, clicking my Mont Blanc Meisterstück pen, I am looking at the legal documents I prepared last night. The company isn't being saved. It's being liquidated. And the primary creditor, the entity that bought up their distressed debt over the last 18 months through a series of anonymous holding companies, is me. Sandra's face is a shade of pale that matches the cream-colored walls of the office. Her breath is shallow, smelling of expensive espresso and desperation. "You can't do this," she says, her voice shaking now, losing the edge of the hiss. "We are your parents. We gave you life." I lean forward, the leather of my ergonomic chair creaking in the silence. The sound is like a gunshot in the quiet room. "No," I say, my voice steady, devoid of the anger I thought I would feel. "You gave me 2 garbage bags and a wet porch. You told me I was a line item you couldn't afford. I took that lesson to heart, Sandra. I looked at the balance sheet of our relationship, and I realized that the cost of maintaining a connection with you far outweighed the emotional return on investment. I've spent 15 years calculating the interest on the trauma you left me with. This is just the final settlement." Marcus finally looks up, his eyes bloodshot. He looks at the window, where the gray Portland rain is starting to smear against the glass, exactly like it did the night they threw me out. "Diana, please," he whispers. "We're family." I stand up, smoothing the front of my blazer. I think about Elena, who died 2 years ago in a hospital bed I paid for, in a private room I made sure was filled with the scent of lavender. She was my family. You two are just a pair of underperforming assets I am finally offloading. According to the documents in front of you, the house in Lake Oswego is being seized by the holding company on Friday at noon. The 2024 Mercedes S-Class is registered to the firm, and as of 10 minutes ago, your corporate lease has been terminated. You have 48 hours to pack your belongings into whatever bags you can find. I suggest you use the heavy-duty drawstrings. They hold up better in the rain. The silence that follows is heavy, thick with the realization that the power dynamic has permanently shifted. They are looking at me not as their daughter, but as the architect of their ruin. They see the monster they created by teaching me that money was the only metric of worth. I walk toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city that once felt so cold and indifferent. Below us, the streets are clogged with the afternoon rush hour, thousands of people moving toward homes where they are hopefully wanted. I think about the 19-year-old version of myself, working 3 jobs and sleeping 4 hours a night, driven by a singular, burning need to never be a line item again. I have achieved that. I am the owner of the ledger now. I turn back to them one last time. Sandra is clutching her pearls so hard the string looks ready to snap. Marcus is slumped over, his head in his hands. There is no joy in this, but there is a profound, echoing sense of justice. It is the cold, hard logic of the universe asserting itself. You reap what you sow, and in the world of the Myers family, you only get what you pay for. They paid for a daughter with indifference, and today, the bill has come due in full. Family isn't a biological entitlement. It is a debt of care and presence that must be paid every single day. If you don't make the payments, you lose the property. It's the simplest rule in real estate, and the one they forgot to follow. I pick up my briefcase, the weight of it familiar and grounding, and walk toward the door without looking back. The click of my heels on the polished granite floor is the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, final punctuation mark on a chapter of my life that has finally been balanced to 0. The contrast between the life I was forced to leave and the one I was building with Uncle Harold was not merely a matter of emotional distance or physical comfort, but was measured in the cold, hard, and unyielding language of numbers that never lied. My biological parents, Richard and Sandra, continued to inhabit that suffocating 1,200-square-foot ranch-style house in a fading suburb of Portland, a structure that seemed to groan under the weight of a mortgage they had recklessly refinanced 3 separate times to fund the bottomless pit of my sister Tiffany's supposed potential. While they were busy bleeding their home equity dry to ensure Tiffany had every superficial advantage, including the purchase of a 2014 Pepper-White Mini Cooper with a sunroof and heated seats for her 16th birthday, a $3,200 used vehicle that required another $1,500 in immediate transmission repairs, I was discovering the grueling reality of self-reliance. Every Saturday and Sunday, and 3 weeknights after my honors classes concluded, I could be found at the Blue Wave Car Wash in the Ballard neighborhood of Seattle, wearing heavy waterproof boots and a neon vest, scrub brush in hand, working 25 hours a week to ensure I never had to ask them for a single cent. I maintained a perfect 4.0 grade point average while my hands were perpetually chapped from the industrial strength soaps and the biting wind coming off Puget Sound, because I knew that excellence was the only currency that would eventually buy my way out of their shadow. Uncle Harold was the antithesis of my father's chaotic and reactive financial instability, providing me with something far more valuable than a mere roof over my head. He gave me a leather-bound physical ledger and a seat at his mahogany desk. He taught me that a person's character is reflected in their cash flow statement, and that the greatest sin one can commit is not being poor, but being unaccountable. While my parents were busy making interest-only payments on credit cards they used to buy Tiffany designer prom dresses and organic meal delivery kits, I was meticulously tracking every single penny of my $42,000 annual university tuition at the University of Washington's Foster School of Business. I kept a running tally in that ledger, documenting the cost of every textbook, every lab fee, and every credit hour with the fervent, desperate intention of paying Harold back for every investment he made in my future. I remember sitting in his study, the air smelling of old library books and expensive scotch, showing him the spreadsheet I had created to amortize my debt to him over a 10-year period starting the moment I graduated. He had looked at the numbers, then looked at me with a mixture of pity and immense pride, and he simply laughed, a deep, resonant sound that bounced off the wood-paneled walls, before telling me to stop thinking like a servant and start thinking like a stakeholder. He didn't want my monthly installments. He told me to take the money I was saving from my car wash shifts and the scholarships I had won and invest it directly into his company's upcoming Series B acquisition of a boutique commercial firm in downtown Seattle. That was the first time I understood the difference between surviving and thriving, between the desperate, small-minded hoarding of my parents and the strategic, expansive vision of a true builder. My mother, Sandra, would spend hours clipping coupons for 50 cents off generic cereal while simultaneously signing papers for a high-interest personal loan to send Tiffany on a spring break trip to Cabo San Lucas because she didn't want her golden child to feel left out. The hypocrisy was a physical weight, a thick fog that had filled our old house until I could barely breathe. But in Harold's world, every dollar had a specific, tactical purpose. I watched him negotiate a $12 million deal for a warehouse complex in Kent, Washington, noticing how he accounted for every minor detail from the property tax escalators to the specific cost of replacing the HVAC units with high-efficiency train models. He treated me as an apprentice rather than a guest, forcing me to sit in on meetings with architects and city planners where the conversations centered on zoning laws, square footage costs, and the delicate art of the capital stack. Meanwhile, the updates I received from home were like dispatches from a sinking ship that refused to acknowledge it was taking on water. My mother would call me once every few months, not to ask how my classes were going or if I was eating enough, but to complain about the rising cost of Tiffany's private equestrian lessons, or to subtly hint that Harold should be doing more for the rest of the family, since he was clearly so comfortable. She talked about the 1,200-square-foot house as if it were a mansion they were struggling to maintain for the sake of the family legacy, ignoring the fact that the paint was peeling in long, jaundiced strips and the roof had a leak over the guest bedroom that they patched with a blue tarp every rainy season. They lived in a state of perpetual financial performance, a theater of the middle class where the costumes were getting threadbare and the actors were exhausted. I remember a specific phone call where Sandra spent 20 minutes detailing the $300 organic birthday cake they had commissioned for Tiffany's 18th birthday, while in the same breath mentioning that they had to skip their dental cleanings because the insurance copay was too high. The sheer, unadulterated madness of their priorities served as a constant fuel for my ambition, a reminder that I had to be the exact opposite of everything they represented. In Harold's house, we ate simple, high-quality meals, and we talked about the global economy and the long-term trends in urban development. He drove a 2019 Volvo XC90, a safe, understated vehicle that he maintained with obsessive care, contrasting sharply with my father's penchant for buying flashy, used luxury cars that spent more time in the shop than on the road. Harold showed me that true wealth was quiet and disciplined, a series of calculated moves made over decades rather than the frantic, desperate grabs for status that defined Richard and Sandra's existence. When it came time to actually execute the Series B acquisition, I stayed up until 3 a.m. for a week straight, analyzing the due diligence reports and checking the seller's financial disclosures for any hidden liabilities. I found a discrepancy in the property's utility billing, a recurring overcharge for sewage that added up to nearly $14,000 a year, and when I brought it to Harold, he didn't just thank me, he gave me a small percentage of the deal's equity as a performance bonus. I didn't spend a dime of it. I entered it into my ledger, not as a debt repayment, but as the beginning of my own capital reserves. By the time I reached my senior year of college, the gap between my reality and my parents' perception of the world had become an unbridgeable chasm. I was managing a small portfolio of residential rentals for Harold, overseeing the maintenance schedules and the tenant screenings with a level of professional rigor that would have terrified my mother. I knew the exact cost per square foot of Berber carpeting versus luxury vinyl plank flooring, and I knew how to negotiate with contractors to ensure we were getting the best possible rate on a roof replacement for a fourplex in Queen Anne. I was learning that power wasn't just about having money, it was about understanding exactly where every dollar went and why. My parents, conversely, were still trapped in their cycle of refinancing and regret, perpetually surprised when the property tax bill arrived or when the water heater inevitably failed. They looked at the world as something that happened to them, a series of unfortunate expenses they couldn't control, whereas Harold and I looked at the world as a series of variables to be managed and optimized. I remember the day I officially graduated, standing in the Husky Stadium with thousands of other students, feeling the weight of the heavy black gown and the even heavier expectations I had placed upon myself. My parents didn't come, claiming that the drive from Portland was too taxing on their car and that Tiffany had a mandatory cheerleading camp that weekend, which required their full attention and financial support. I wasn't even hurt. I was relieved. Having them there would have felt like an intrusion of the past into a future they had no part in building. Harold was there, though, standing by the railing in his sensible beige trench coat, holding a single high-quality leather portfolio as a graduation gift. Inside was not a check, but a contract, a formal offer to join his firm as a junior analyst with a starting salary that was more than my father had ever earned in a single year of his life. I accepted the position on the spot, not because I needed the security, but because I wanted to continue the education that had started on that rainy porch 15 years ago. I wanted to master the machinery of the world so completely that no one could ever tell me again that I was an expense they couldn't afford. I took that ledger Harold had given me, the one where I had meticulously tracked my tuition and my car wash earnings, and I turned to a fresh white page. I wrote down my starting salary, my equity stake in the Series B acquisition, and the current balance of my savings account. The numbers were still modest compared to the millions Harold moved, but they were mine. They were the evidence of a life built from the ground up, a life that was no longer defined by the scarcity and the selfishness of Richard and Sandra Myers. I was 21 years old, and for the first time, the balance sheet of my life was firmly in the black. I had transformed from a line item on someone else's budget into the person who would eventually write the budget for everyone else. The journey from that southeast Portland porch to the 47th floor was long and paved with the grit of thousands of hours of labor. But as I looked at the numbers on that page, I knew that every single minute of struggle had been a necessary investment in the woman I was becoming. I was no longer a daughter in search of a home. I was an executive in search of an empire, and I was just getting started. The betrayal did not happen with a grand cinematic gesture or a thunderous confrontation, but rather it solidified in the mundane, suffocating atmosphere of a Tuesday evening on June 18, 2010, at exactly 6:14 p.m., according to the digital clock on the microwave that pulsed with a rhythmic, sickly green light. The air in our cramped kitchen was heavy and stagnant, saturated with the cloying, oily smell of cheap, over-fried fish sticks that Sandra had pulled from a yellow cardboard box bought on clearance at the local Safeway. My mother didn't even bother to look up from her plastic coupon organizer, her fingers flicking through colorful scraps of paper with a predatory precision as she delivered the sentence that would effectively exile me from the only home I had ever known. She told me, with a flatness in her voice that suggested she was discussing a grocery list rather than my future, that Tiffany needed the $800 I had painstakingly saved from my part-time tutoring and odd jobs because she had been accepted into a prestigious summer drama camp in Ashland. I remember the exact way the linoleum floor felt beneath my socks, cold and slightly tacky, as she explained that my obsession with the regional STEM scholarship and my advanced robotics project was nothing more than a childish hobby, whereas Tiffany's career in the performing arts represented a legitimate future for the family name. When I finally found my voice and said the word no, a word I had rarely used in that household of forced obedience, the temperature in the room seemed to plummet until the very air turned to jagged shards of ice. I explained that the $800 was for my own enrollment fees and the specialized components I needed to compete for the university grant that would be my only ticket out of Southeast Portland. But Sandra simply snapped the lid of her organizer shut with a sound like a bone breaking. She looked at me then, her eyes devoid of any maternal warmth, and informed me that if I was going to be selfish and prioritize my little science experiments over my sister's once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, then I clearly didn't understand what it meant to be part of a family. The argument that followed wasn't a debate, but a systematic dismantling of my status as a daughter, a process that concluded with my meager belongings being shoved into those two black, Glad drawstring garbage bags that would eventually become the symbols of my liberation. By 10 o'clock that same night, the sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the world bathed in a bruised purple twilight that felt as lonely as I was as I sat on the edge of the curb with my bags slumped beside me. The streetlights flickered with a low electrical hum, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked asphalt of our driveway where my father, Richard, stood silhouetted in the yellow glow of the hallway light. He didn't come out to the porch to talk to me, and he certainly didn't offer to drive me anywhere. He just stood there with his grease-stained hands shoved deep into the pockets of his frayed Carhartt work pants, staring at a spot on the floorboards as if they held the secrets of his own cowardice. He watched his 13-year-old daughter wait for 4 agonizing hours for a man he hadn't spoken to in nearly a decade. his silence serving as a final, crushing confirmation that he would always choose the path of least resistance over the protection of his own flesh and blood. The weight of that silence was heavier than the garbage bags, a suffocating realization that the man who had taught me how to ride a bike was now perfectly content to watch me vanish into the night as long as it meant he didn't have to argue with Sandra. I remember the sound of the crickets in the overgrown grass of our lawn, a frantic, repetitive chirping that seemed to mock the stillness of the house behind me. Every time a car turned onto our street, my heart would lurch into my throat, the headlights sweeping over me like a searchlight before disappearing into the darkness of the neighboring blocks. I spent those 4 hours mentally calculating the cost of my existence in that house, tallying the meals I had eaten and the clothes they had bought me, realizing with a cold, mathematical clarity that I had been a net loss in their ledger from the very beginning. I wasn't a person to them. I was an overhead expense that they were finally, mercifully, offloading. The night air grew damp and biting, the kind of Pacific Northwest chill that seeps through denim and settles in your bones, but I refused to move from that curb, anchored by a stubborn, burning pride that had replaced my fear. I thought about the STEM scholarship, about the complex equations I had mastered and the way I could make a circuit board sing with the right connections, and I realized that my parents were right about one thing. I was different from them. I possessed a capacity for logic and long-term planning that was entirely foreign to their impulsive, reactive world of payday loans and refinanced dreams. While they were focused on the immediate gratification of Tiffany's drama camp, I was already envisioning the architecture of my revenge, which wouldn't be built with anger or violence, but with a success so absolute and a wealth so staggering that it would eventually eclipse everything they held dear. When the headlights of Uncle Harold's 2005 Subaru Outback finally illuminated the street, cutting through the darkness with a steady, reliable beam, I didn't cry, and I didn't look back at the shadow of my father in the doorway. I stood up, my legs stiff and cramping from the cold, and I picked up my 2 bags with a strength I didn't know I possessed. Harold didn't say much when he pulled up to the curb. He just popped the trunk and got out to help me load my life into the back of his car, his movements calm and deliberate. He looked at the house once, a sharp, disapproving glance at the figure still standing in the hallway before turning his full attention back to me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, his palm warm and steady, and told me that the math at that house had been wrong for a long time, but that we were going to start a new set of books starting tonight. As we drove away from the sagging porch and the smell of fried fish sticks, I watched the house shrink in the rearview mirror until it was nothing more than a flickering light in a sea of shadows. I thought about the $800 Sandra had stolen for Tiffany's career, and I made a silent vow to myself that I would turn that loss into a multi-million-dollar gain. I realized then that betrayal is a powerful catalyst for growth if you have the discipline to harness the energy it creates. My parents thought they were discarding a line item they couldn't afford, but they were actually releasing the only person who would have ever been capable of saving them when the inevitable collapse arrived. They traded a future of stability and loyalty for a few weeks of drama camp and a quiet house, a transaction so fundamentally flawed that it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The drive to Seattle was 5 hours of quiet contemplation, punctuated only by the soft click of the turn signal and the steady rhythm of the windshield wipers as a light drizzle began to fall. Harold didn't try to fill the silence with platitudes or false comfort. He understood that I was mourning the death of an illusion and that I needed the time to process the transition from a child to a survivor. I spent the journey looking out at the passing highway signs, reading the names of cities and exits as if they were milestones on a map of my new life. I was no longer Diana, the unwanted daughter of Richard and Sandra Myers. I was an independent entity, a piece of raw material that I would spend the next 15 years refining into a weapon of financial precision. By the time we reached the outskirts of Seattle and the skyline began to rise up like a shimmering silver forest against the early morning sky, the betrayal of June 18th had already been codified into the foundation of my identity. I had learned that the world was a marketplace where value was determined by what you could produce and what you could control, and I was determined to become the most valuable person in every room I entered. I looked at my hands, small and pale in the dim light of the dashboard, and I promised them that they would one day sign contracts worth more than the entire neighborhood I had just left behind. The $800 was gone, but the lesson it bought me was worth millions. I understood now that family wasn't a safety net. It was a potential liability that had to be managed with extreme caution. As the Subaru pulled into the driveway of Harold's modest but impeccably maintained home, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The old ledger was closed, the pages torn out and burned in the fire of that southeast Portland porch. A new ledger was opening, and this time I was the one who held the pen, the one who defined the terms, and the only one who would ever be allowed to audit the results. The interior of Uncle Harold's 2005 gray Honda Civic was a sanctuary of mechanical hums and the faint, comforting scent of old upholstery and peppermint gum, a stark departure from the suffocating, grease-laden air of the house I had just been exiled from. As we merged onto Interstate 5 North, leaving the flickering neon signs of southeast Portland behind, I found that I couldn't summon a single tear. My eyes felt as dry and calibrated as the digital display on the car's dashboard. My heart wasn't breaking. It was hardening into a diamond-edged tool, recalibrating itself for a world where emotions were nothing more than static interference in a much larger, more complex calculation of survival. Uncle Harold kept his eyes on the road, his weathered hands steady on the steering wheel at a precise 10-2 position, giving me the kind of respectful, heavy silence that I desperately needed to begin my internal audit. I reached into the center console and found a discarded, slightly crumpled Starbucks napkin and a stolen black Bic ballpoint pen with a chewed cap, and I used the flat surface of my thigh as a makeshift desk to begin the work of my life. I didn't write a diary entry or a letter of grievance. Instead, I drew two perfectly straight vertical columns on that thin, fibrous piece of paper, titling them with a clinical detachment that would define the next 15 years of my existence. In the left column, I wrote the word them, and in the right column, I wrote the word me. And beneath those headings, I began the process of reclassifying the people I had once called my family. Under them, I didn't write names like Richard or Sandra or Tiffany, but instead I wrote the single damning word liabilities, because that is exactly what they had proven to be: unpredictable, draining, and fundamentally insolvent in their capacity for loyalty. They were a series of high-interest debts on my soul, consuming my time, my energy, and my peace for a 0% return on investment. Under me, I pressed the pen firmly into the napkin until the ink bled through the layers, writing the word asset in bold, capitalized letters, because I realized in that quiet, moving car that I was the only reliable piece of collateral I had left. The realization hit me with the force of a market crash. Family isn't a birthright or a sacred, unbreakable bond, but rather it is a meritocracy where your seat at the table is earned through the value you bring and the stability you maintain. My parents had looked at the balance sheet of their lives and decided that a 13-year-old girl with an interest in robotics and finance was a line item they could no longer afford to service, and in that moment, I accepted their terms with a chilling finality. If they wanted me out of their personal ledger, I would make sure that I was the only one left with the capital, the influence, and the sheer, unadulterated power to decide who lived in luxury and who faded into the obscurity of their own bad decisions. I watched the green highway signs flash past: Centralia, Olympia, Tacoma, each one a mile marker moving me further away from the girl who hoped to be loved and closer to the woman who intended to be indispensable. I spent the rest of the 3-hour drive meticulously detailing the technical specifications of my own reconstruction, treating my personality and my intellect as a project in forensic engineering. I looked at my reflection in the window, my face illuminated by the passing headlights of 18-wheelers and commuter cars, and I didn't see a victim. I saw a startup with a $0 valuation that was about to undergo the most aggressive expansion in history. Uncle Harold's Honda Civic, with its 187,000 miles on the odometer and its slightly rattling passenger door, felt like a chariot carrying me toward a destiny that I would write in the ink of acquisition and liquidation. I decided that I would never again allow my worth to be determined by people who couldn't even manage a household budget without a predatory second mortgage. I would learn the tax codes, I would master the nuances of real estate law, and I would become so proficient in the movement of money that I would eventually own the very air they breathed. When we finally crossed the Ship Canal Bridge and the Seattle skyline rose up in a jagged, crystalline wall of light and steel, I felt a surge of cold, electric energy vibrate through my spine. The Space Needle stood like a glowing needle on a grand scale, and I imagined it as a pen held by a giant hand, ready to sign the first of many contracts that would bear my name. Uncle Harold glanced over at the napkin in my hand, seeing the columns and the stark economic language of my grief, and he gave a small, grim nod of approval. He didn't tell me that things would be okay or that my parents would eventually realize their mistake, because he knew as well as I did that some debts are too large to ever be reconciled. Instead, he reached into his pocket and handed me a $10 bill, telling me that this was my first operating budget and that I should think carefully about how to invest it. I folded the napkin carefully, tucking it into the pocket of my worn jeans as if it were a holy relic, a reminder of the night I stopped being a daughter and started being a competitor. The silence in the car was no longer heavy with sadness, but rather it was pressurized with the weight of my new ambition, a silent pact between myself and the city that waited for me. I began to map out the next 5 years, calculating the number of hours I would need to work at the Ballard car wash to pay for my own health insurance and the specific GPA I would need to secure a full-ride scholarship to the University of Washington. I thought about the 2014 Pepperwhite Mini Cooper. My parents would eventually buy for Tiffany, and I compared it in my mind to the fleet of black SUVs I would one day command, seeing the disparity not as an injustice, but as a strategic advantage. Let them have their used cars and their drama camps. I would have the skyscrapers and the voting shares. I realized that by casting me out, they had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible, the total absence of expectation and the freedom to be as ruthless as the market required. As we pulled into the driveway of Harold's small, tidy home in the Sunset Hill neighborhood, where the grass was trimmed to a uniform 2 inches and the porch light was a warm, welcoming amber, I felt the final traces of my old life evaporate into the salty Seattle air. I stepped out of the Honda Civic, my legs feeling strong and steady on the pavement, and I took a deep breath of the damp northern wind. I looked back at the shadow of the man who had driven me here, a man who believed in the integrity of a ledger and the power of a quiet life, and I knew that while I would always be grateful for his shelter, I would eventually outgrow even his modest dreams. I was building something bigger, something that would require a foundation of cold, calculated precision and a complete lack of sentimentality. I walked toward the front door, leaving the 2 black garbage bags in the trunk for a moment longer, savoring the feeling of being completely unburdened by the weight of a family that didn't want me. That Starbucks napkin became the blueprint for my entire career, the original document from which every subsequent merger, acquisition, and hostile takeover was born. For years, I kept it in a small, fireproof safe in my office, a reminder of the night I redefined the word family to mean a group of individuals whose interests were aligned for mutual profit. Every time I had to fire a low-performing employee or squeeze a competitor out of a lucrative market, I would think about that 2-column list and the cold silence of Uncle Harold's car. I would remember that being an asset means being valuable regardless of the circumstances, while being a liability means being something to be disposed of at the first sign of trouble. I chose to be the asset that would eventually buy the company, the house, and the very ground beneath the feet of the people who had tried to write me off. Standing now on the 47th floor of the Wells Fargo Center, 15 years removed from that drive, I can still feel the texture of that napkin in my memory, the way the cheap ballpoint pen had snagged on the fibers. My mother, Sandra, and my father, Richard, are still sitting in front of me, looking like the ultimate liabilities, broken, outdated, and entirely out of options. They are looking for a bailout, a grace period, a restructuring of the debt they owe me for the decades of neglect and the final betrayal in the kitchen. But as I look at them, I don't see parents. I see two entries in the left column of a list I started when I was 13 years old. I see the math that doesn't work and the debt that can no longer be serviced. I pick up my own pen, a gold-nibbed masterpiece that costs more than their monthly mortgage payment, and I prepare to settle the account once and for all. The meritocracy of our relationship has reached its logical conclusion, and I am the one with all the capital. The silence in the conference room is identical to the silence in the Honda Civic, but this time I am the one driving. I look at the legal documents that will effectively erase their lifestyle, and I feel nothing but the satisfaction of a balanced ledger. I realize that the little girl on the porch would be proud of the woman I've become, not because I am rich, but because I am no longer at the mercy of anyone else's budget. I have turned the pain of that June evening into a $23.7 million reality, a physical manifestation of the fact that I was never a line item they couldn't afford, but a visionary they weren't smart enough to invest in. As I sign my name at the bottom of the final liquidation order, the ink flowing smooth and black like oil, I know that the columns are finally closed. There is no them left in my world, only the me that survived, thrived, and eventually owned it all. The journey is complete, the debt is collected, and for the first time in my life, I am the only one left standing on the right side of the balance sheet. The arsenal was not composed of weapons or steel, but was instead meticulously gathered within the unassuming confines of a thick, heavy-duty manila folder stamped with the clinical designation File Number 2010-GH5847 in bold, black, indelible ink. This folder, which felt as heavy as a cornerstone in my hands, rested on a polished cherrywood desk belonging to Margaret Morrison, an estate attorney of such formidable reputation that she billed exactly $450 an hour for the privilege of her silence or her speech. Margaret sat across from me in a high-backed executive chair upholstered in deep emerald leather that emitted the faint, sophisticated scent of expensive pipe tobacco, aged parchment, and the kind of old success that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. As the afternoon sun filtered through the slats of the mahogany blinds in her downtown Seattle office, casting long, sharp shadows across the carpet, I realized that we didn't just possess a copy of my parents' latest desperate legal maneuvers or a simple contested will. We held the absolute, irrefutable proof of their historical moral and financial bankruptcy, starting with the original voluntary relinquishment of parental rights document that Richard and Sandra had signed with such chilling alacrity in the winter of 2010. I stared at their signatures on that yellowing paper, noticing how Sandra's cursive was tight and hurried, as if she couldn't wait to be rid of the liability that was her 13-year-old daughter, while Richard's signature was a faint, wavering line that spoke of a man who had long ago traded his spine for a moment of quiet. Beneath that document lay the cold, hard mathematical reality of my father's failures, specifically a series of certified bank statements documenting an $80,000 personal loan Harold had extended to him in 2002 to save that 1,200-square-foot house from a previous foreclosure. The loan had been structured with a 7% compounded interest rate, a figure Richard had likely ignored in his typical short-sightedness. And as I looked at Margaret's calculated projections, I saw that the total moral and financial debt had ballooned to over $380,000. This wasn't just a number on a page. It was a weight that had been pulling at Harold's estate for over 2 decades, a debt that Richard had never made a single attempt to reconcile, even as he spent money on Tiffany's used cars and vanity projects. Margaret tapped her gold-rimmed spectacles against the edge of the folder, her expression unreadable, but her eyes sharp with the predatory instinct of a lawyer who smelled blood in the water. She pointed to the next section of the file, which contained an exhaustive chronological log of every single email Sandra had sent to Harold over the last 15 years, each one a masterpiece of manipulative begging and thinly veiled entitlement. Every message was logged, time-stamped, and printed in triplicate, creating a paper trail of greed that was impossible to deny, showing a woman who viewed her brother-in-law not as a relative, but as an ATM to be raided whenever the consequences of her own bad spending caught up with her. I reached out and touched the edge of the printed emails, feeling the slight grit of the laser toner under my fingertips as I read through a particularly galling message from 2016 where Sandra asked for $10,000 for Tiffany's college graduation party while I was working double shifts at the car wash to pay for my own textbooks. The contrast was so sharp, it felt like a physical blow, a reminder that while I was building a life out of grit and spreadsheets, my biological parents were trying to build a lifestyle out of theft and guilt. Margaret leaned forward, the emerald leather of her chair creaking softly in the quiet room, and explained that in the eyes of the law, the relinquishment of rights coupled with the unpaid debt created a powerful barrier against any claim they might try to make on Harold's multi-million-dollar commercial portfolio. We were no longer just defending an inheritance. We were executing a long-overdue foreclosure on their lives, using the very tools of accounting and law that I had spent my entire adulthood mastering. I thought about the Starbucks napkin I had used in the back of the Honda Civic, that original ledger of assets and liabilities, and I realized that this manila folder was simply the final, expanded version of that list, a comprehensive audit of two people who had spent their lives in the red. The technical precision of the file was staggering, reflecting Margaret's $450 an hour attention to detail, as it included everything from Richard's gambling markers at the Alani Casino to the specific dates Sandra had missed mortgage payments while simultaneously posting photos of expensive dinners on social media. We had transcripts of voicemails where Richard's voice sounded thick with cheap bourbon as he demanded Harold show some family loyalty, a word he clearly didn't understand the definition of, and we had the returned checks from the few times Harold had tried to help, only to have the money diverted to Tiffany's credit card bills. Every page I turned was another nail in the coffin of their defense, a systematic dismantling of the narrative they were trying to project to the probate court. They wanted to appear as grieving relatives who had been unfairly excluded from a family fortune, but the manila folder told the story of two predators who had abandoned their own child and bled their benefactor dry until his heart finally gave out. I felt a surge of cold, analytical satisfaction as I realized that Richard and Sandra had no idea this arsenal existed, that they truly believed their past actions had no paper trail and that their current desperation would outweigh their historical negligence. Margaret Morrison didn't believe in coincidences or emotional pleas. She believed in the weight of evidence, and as she closed the folder, the sound was as final as a prison door slamming shut. She told me that the 2010 relinquishment was the most critical piece of the puzzle because it legally severed the branch they were now trying to climb back out on, making them strangers to the estate in every way that mattered to a judge. The $80,000 of principal debt, now grown to nearly $400,000 through the relentless logic of compounded interest, served as a secondary line of defense that would bankrupt them even if they managed to find a loophole in the parental rights filing. I sat there in the silence of that high-rise office, looking out at the gray, rain-streaked Seattle skyline, and I felt the presence of Uncle Harold in the room, his laughter echoing in the corners as his final move on the chessboard was revealed. He hadn't just left me a company. He had left me the armor and the weaponry to protect it from the very people he knew would come circling like vultures the moment he was gone. He had known that I would be the one to hold the pen, and he had made sure that the ink I used was backed by the full force of the law and the unyielding truth of the numbers. The smell of tobacco and success in the room felt like a preview of my own future, a world where I was no longer defined by what was taken from me, but by what I was capable of defending. I looked at the stamp file number 2010-GH5847, and I saw the end of a 15-year war that had started on a wet porch in Portland and was ending here, in a sanctuary of high-end litigation and forensic accounting. My parents had spent their lives playing a short game, chasing the immediate gratification of a used Mini Cooper or a drama camp, while I had been playing the long game, investing every ounce of my pain into the acquisition of this specific, devastating knowledge. They were coming to the mediation meeting tomorrow thinking they were entering a negotiation, but as I stood up and shook Margaret's hand, I knew they were actually walking into an execution. There would be no settlements, no compromise, and certainly no mercy, because mercy is a luxury that requires a positive balance in the account of character, and Richard and Sandra Myers had been overdrawn for a very long time. I took a deep breath, the air in the office feeling clean and sharp, and I felt the weight of the manila folder in my hand, a physical manifestation of the justice that numbers provide when they are finally allowed to tell the whole story. As I walked out of the office and into the sterile, marble-lined hallway of the Wells Fargo Center, the click of my heels sounded like the ticking of a clock counting down to the moment of their ultimate reckoning. I thought about the $380,000 moral debt, and I wondered if they even remembered the original $80,000, or if they had simply convinced themselves that Harold owed them the money as a birthright. It didn't matter what they believed anymore. The ledger was closed, the audit was complete, and the results were non-negotiable. I was the chief financial officer of my own destiny, and I had just authorized the final liquidation of my past. Tomorrow, when I opened that manila folder in front of them, I wouldn't be looking for an apology or a reconciliation. I would be looking for the look on their faces when they realized that the line item they couldn't afford had grown into the power that would finally and permanently erase them from the balance sheet. The arsenal was ready, the strategy was flawless, and for the first time in 28 years, the numbers were exactly where I wanted them to be. I headed toward the elevator, the reflection of the city lights shimmering in the polished brass doors, and I realized that the cold, hard contrast of my life had finally been resolved into a single, unshakable truth. You cannot steal a future from someone who has already bought and paid for it with their own survival. The day of the final reckoning, which I had internally labeled the execution, unfolded within a high-security conference room on the 52nd floor of the Columbia Center, a space where the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, almost godlike view of Elliott Bay, where the charcoal gray waters churned under a typical Pacific Northwest overcast sky. There were exactly 14 people present in that room, creating a heavy, pressurized atmosphere of professional scrutiny and dormant family trauma that felt like a physical weight against my chest. The assembly was a calculated mix of neutral observers and interested parties. 3 senior auditors from Deloitte, who sat with their silver laptops open and ready, 2 somber representatives from the Seattle Children's Hospital Foundation, Harold's favorite charity, 4 legal assistants, my attorney Margaret Morrison, and the 3 ghosts of my past who had come to claim a fortune they had never earned. Sandra arrived wearing a $400 black sheath dress from Nordstrom that she had clearly purchased specifically for this occasion to project an image of dignified mourning, though the illusion was shattered by the cloying, suffocating scent of Elizabeth Arden Red Door perfume and the unmistakable metallic tang of desperation that seemed to radiate from her skin. She spent the first 10 minutes in the room playing the role of the grieving, misunderstood sister-in-law, fluttering around the table and patting the hands of the hospital board members with a performative sympathy that made my stomach churn with a cold, familiar disgust. I sat at the absolute head of the long, polished obsidian table, a position of undisputed authority that I had occupied for the last 3 years of Harold's failing health, dressed in a $1,200 navy-tailored suit from Theory that fit me like a suit of modern armor. My Breitling Navitimer watch, a gift to myself after my first $1 million closing, ticked with a rhythmic, mechanical precision toward exactly 2:00 p.m., the sound echoing in my ears like a countdown to a controlled demolition. I was the personification of the fortress Harold had built. I was the armor that protected his legacy, and the 3 people sitting across from me, Sandra, Richard, and a silent, pouting Tiffany, were the targets of a 15-year ballistic trajectory of cold, hard facts. Richard sat to Sandra's left, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was too tight around the neck, his eyes darting toward the mahogany sideboard where the catering staff had placed a silver coffee service, while Tiffany kept her head down, her fingers nervously picking at a chipped manicure as she realized for the first time that her drama camp charisma had no currency in a room full of forensic accountants. The silence that descended upon the room at 2 o'clock sharp was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the building's climate control system and the distant, muffled horn of a ferry crossing the bay. Margaret Morrison opened the manila folder, file number 2010-GH5847, with a deliberate slowness that allowed every person in the room to see the stamp of the court and the weight of the evidence we were about to discharge. Sandra began to speak, her voice a practiced, shaky vibrato as she talked about how much Harold had meant to the family and how he would have wanted his only brother to be taken care of in his twilight years. But I cut her off with a single, sharp look that caused her to falter mid-sentence. I didn't raise my voice. I simply leaned forward, the light from the window glinting off the polished steel of my watch, and informed her that this meeting was not a sentimental retrospective, but a formal settlement of the estate's liabilities, of which she and Richard were the primary entries. I watched the blood drain from her face, leaving her expensive foundation looking like a pale, cracked mask as I began to read from the ledger of their failures, starting with the 2010 relinquishment of parental rights that they had signed for the price of $800 and a quiet house. The execution was not a singular blow, but a systematic dismantling of their pride, cent by cent and document by document, as I presented the auditors and the charity reps with the evidence of the $380,000 debt that Richard still owed the estate. I saw the hospital board members pull back in their chairs, their expressions shifting from polite sympathy to professional horror as they realized they were sitting across from people who had not only abandoned their child, but had spent 2 decades attempting to defraud the very man who had kept them solvent. Richard tried to bluster, his face turning a mottled, angry purple as he muttered something about family loyalty and the spirit of the law. But Margaret Morrison silenced him with a single, ice-cold recitation of the compound interest clauses he had signed in 2002. Every time Sandra tried to interject with a sob or a plea for mercy, I met her eyes with a flat, unyielding stare, reminding her silently of the rainy porch in southeast Portland and the 2 black garbage bags that had once contained my entire world. I was no longer the girl they could ignore. I was the CFO of their destruction, and I had accounted for every single drop of bitterness they had ever fed me. The technical precision of the presentation was flawless, a masterclass in how to use the machinery of the law to achieve a total and permanent social and financial liquidation. We showed the records of the shell companies I had used to buy up their debt, the specific dates when their mortgage had been transferred to my holding firm, and the final notices of eviction that were currently being served to their front door by a sheriff's deputy while we sat in this climate-controlled sanctuary. The realization that they weren't just losing an inheritance, but were actively losing the roof over their heads, hit Richard so hard he had to grab the edge of the obsidian table to keep from falling out of his chair. Tiffany finally looked up, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp terror as she realized that the sister she had spent a lifetime looking down upon was now the woman who held the keys to her very existence. It was the most honest I had ever seen her, stripped of the drama and the performance, faced with the unyielding reality of a balance sheet that had finally been called due. As the meeting stretched into its second hour, the air in the room seemed to grow thinner, pressurized by the weight of the evidence and the absolute lack of an exit strategy for my parents. The auditors were nodding in agreement with my calculations, their pens scratching across their pads as they validated the total and complete exclusion of the Myers branch from the Harold Myers Commercial Trust. Sandra was no longer patting anyone's hand. She was clutching her black handbag against her chest as if it were a life preserver, her eyes fixed on the Breitling watch on my wrist as if it were a ticking bomb. I realized in that moment that I felt no joy in their suffering, but I felt a profound, echoing sense of completion, a feeling of a circle finally closing after 15 years of jagged, open-ended pain. I was the personification of the math they couldn't afford to get wrong, the living proof that you cannot build a life on the exploitation of others without eventually encountering the person who will make you pay for it with interest. I concluded the meeting by sliding 3 identical envelopes across the table, each containing a one-way bus ticket to a small town in eastern Oregon and a list of local homeless shelters and job placement agencies. I told them, my voice as cold and clear as the water in the bay, that the estate had authorized a one-time humanitarian disbursement of $50 per person, provided they signed the final non-disclosure and non-interference agreements immediately. The charity representatives looked on in a silence that was not judgmental, but rather an acknowledgement of a debt being settled with a ruthless, surgical efficiency. Sandra looked at the bus ticket, then looked at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. But no words came out because there were no words left in the English language that could reconcile the deficit of her character. She signed the paper with a trembling hand, followed by a defeated Richard and a sobbing Tiffany, their signatures looking like small, pathetic scratches against the weight of the legal parchment. When they finally stood up to leave, they didn't look like the powerful, controlling figures of my childhood. They looked like small, discarded things, relics of a world that had been built on shadows and lies. They walked toward the door of the conference room, their footsteps muffled by the expensive carpet, and not one of them dared to look back at the woman sitting at the head of the table. I watched them go through the double-glass doors, their reflections blurring into the gray skyline of Seattle, until they were gone from my sight and my life forever. The room was suddenly very quiet, the tension dissipating like steam from a kettle, leaving behind only the clean, sterile scent of the office and the steady, reassuring tick of my watch. I turned my chair toward the window, looking out at the cargo ships moving slowly across Elliott Bay, and I felt a deep, settled peace that I had never known before. The execution was over, and the empire was safe, but more importantly, the girl on the porch was finally, truly home. I had taken the line item they couldn't afford and turned it into a $23.7 million legacy of strength, resilience, and unshakable truth. I picked up my Montblanc pen and signed the final closure report for file number 2010-GH5847, the ink flowing smooth and definitive across the page. The auditors stood up, shaking my hand with a newfound respect, and the charity representatives thanked me for ensuring the future of the foundation. I was the chief financial officer of a real estate empire, but I was also the architect of my own salvation. As I walked out of the Columbia Center and into the cool, damp air of the Seattle afternoon, I realized that family isn't something you are born with. It is something you build, piece by piece, ledger by ledger, until you have created a world where the numbers always add up to love, loyalty, and the freedom to never look back. The past was a closed book. The debt was paid in full, and for the first time in 28 years, my life was perfectly, beautifully balanced. The public execution of my biological parents' expectations began at exactly 2:15 p.m., a moment marked by the heavy, rhythmic clicking of the overhead ventilation and the distant, muffled roar of a container ship navigating the gray expanse of Elliott Bay. The atmosphere in the 52nd floor conference room was thick with the scent of high-end stationery and the cold, metallic tang of an impending financial storm, as Margaret Morrison, my $450 an hour estate attorney, adjusted her gold-rimmed spectacles and began to read Clause 7 of the finalized trust agreement. As the words of the adoption clause spilled into the sterile air, a silence so profound and absolute descended upon the 14 people present that I could literally hear the individual drops of the unrelenting Seattle rain hitting the reinforced glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. Sandra, who had been sitting with a practiced air of mournful entitlement, suddenly let out a shriek that was less a human sound and more the screech of metal on metal. her face draining of all color until it matched the bleached off-white bone of the expensive pearls she was clutching. "Adopted?" she gasped, the word hanging in the air like a poisonous fog, and I felt a surge of clinical satisfaction as I reached into my leather briefcase and withdrew a certified, notarized copy of the 2012 adoption papers, sliding them across the $30,000 mahogany table with the slow, deliberate grace of a dealer revealing a winning hand. I looked directly into her bloodshot eyes and told her, without a single tremor of emotion in my voice, that legally speaking, she was no longer my mother and had not been for over a decade. I explained with the cold precision of a chief financial officer that according to the laws of the state of Washington, she was merely a stranger who had once provided me with temporary, substandard housing during my formative years, a role that had been officially and permanently terminated when Uncle Harold stepped in to rectify the accounting error of my birth. Sandra's hands began to shake so violently that she dropped her designer clutch, and the sound of it hitting the carpet was the only punctuation to my statement as I moved on to the next item in my arsenal, the forensic audit of Richard's unpaid $80,000 loan from 2002. I didn't raise my voice because the numbers were loud enough on their own, echoing through the room as I detailed the 7% compounded interest that had transformed his original negligence into a staggering $380,000 liability. By the time I reached the final tally of their cumulative failures, documenting every missed payment and every ignored plea for basic decency, Richard was staring at the scuffed toes of his off-brand dress shoes with a posture of total, abject defeat, while Sandra began to hyperventilate into a monogrammed silk handkerchief that smelled faintly of the Elizabeth Arden perfume she had used to mask her desperation. I sat there in my $1,200 navy-tailored suit, the embodiment of a world they were no longer a part of, and watched as the reality of their insolvency finally settled into their bones. Every person in that room, the auditors from Deloitte, the charity representatives from Seattle Children's Hospital, and the silent legal assistants, witnessed the moment the Myers legacy was liquidated in real time, replaced by the indisputable authority of my ledger. I continued to read from the manila folder, my voice steady and rhythmic, listing the dates of every email Sandra had sent begging for money while I was working double shifts at a Ballard car wash to pay for the very textbooks that allowed me to sit at the head of this table today. The contrast between the 13-year-old girl sitting on 2 black garbage bags and the 28-year-old woman holding the pen of destiny was a mathematical certainty that could no longer be ignored or bargained away. Sandra tried to interrupt, her voice a thin, ragged warble as she mentioned the 1,200-square-foot house and the family values she claimed to have instilled in me. But I simply pointed to the line item on the audit that showed she had prioritized Tiffany's $800 drama camp over my basic health insurance. I told her that in the world of high-stakes finance, you cannot expect a return on an investment you never made, and that her maternal stock had been delisted from my exchange years ago for a total lack of performance. The look of sheer, unadulterated terror on her face when she realized that the 2012 adoption had stripped her of any standing to contest Harold's multi-million-dollar commercial portfolio was the only dividend I needed from this entire ordeal. Richard made one last, pathetic attempt to speak, his grease-stained hands trembling on the mahogany surface, but he was silenced by the cold, hard logic of the $380,000 debt that Margaret Morrison reminded him was now immediately due to the estate. As I moved through the final pages of the execution, I felt the presence of Uncle Harold in the room, his quiet strength and his love for the integrity of a well-balanced book serving as the wind at my back. I was not acting out of a desire for petty revenge, but out of a commitment to the fundamental principles of accountability that he had taught me at his kitchen table. I was closing the books on a pair of underperforming assets who had spent their lives trying to short-sell my future, and as the final signature was placed on the liquidation order, the silence in the room changed from one of shock to one of finality. Sandra's hyperventilation slowed into a rhythmic, pathetic sobbing, and Richard remained slumped in his chair, a man who had finally realized that he was the architect of his own ruin. The auditors closed their silver laptops with a series of sharp mechanical clicks that sounded like the closing of a vault, signaling that the truth had been officially recorded and verified by the highest authorities in the industry. I leaned back in my executive chair, the emerald leather creaking softly, and looked out at the skyline of the city that had raised me when my biological parents had refused the job. I thought about the Starbucks napkin from the Honda Civic and the 2-column list of assets and liabilities, and I realized that every single entry had been accurately resolved according to the meritocracy of my new life. I had turned the betrayal of June 18, 2010, into a $23.7 million reality, a physical and legal fortress that no amount of manipulative sobbing or historical revisionism could ever penetrate. I told them both that the meeting was adjourned and that they had exactly 60 seconds to vacate the premises before security escorted them out of the building and back into the rain that they so richly deserved. As they stood up, moving with the heavy, uncoordinated steps of people who had lost everything, I didn't feel a single spark of pity. I only felt the immense cooling relief of a ledger that had finally, after 15 long and grueling years, been balanced to zero. The 3 envelopes containing the one-way bus tickets remained on the table, a final insult to their misplaced pride and a practical solution to their impending homelessness. But they were too shattered to even reach for them. I watched them walk toward the door, their reflections in the polished obsidian table stretching out like shadows of a past that I had finally outrun. When the door finally clicked shut behind them, leaving only the professionals and the ghosts of my real family in the room, I took a deep, steadying breath of the filtered, climate-controlled air. I was Diana Myers, Chief Financial Officer, daughter of Harold, and the sole owner of a future that I had bought and paid for with the currency of my own resilience. The public execution was over, the estate was secure, and as I picked up my gold-nibbed Montblanc pen to sign the final disbursement to the Children's Hospital, I knew that the math of my life had finally reached its perfect, unshakable conclusion. I walked toward the window, the city of Seattle sprawling out beneath me in all its gray, industrious glory, and I realized that the only line item that ever truly mattered was the one that read Survivor, and that was the one I would carry with me into the bright, prosperous morning of my own making. The aftermath of the execution was as clinical and devoid of sentiment as the foreclosure of a failing retail strip mall, a process defined by the rustle of expensive bond paper and the retreating footsteps of people who had finally run out of lies. Victor Harrington, the cut-rate attorney my parents had hired in a desperate attempt to claw back into Harold's estate, looked at the mountain of evidence we had presented, the adoption papers, the unpaid $80,000 loan, and the documented years of neglect. And he did the only thing a sensible lawyer could do in the face of a total legal massacre. He tucked his tail between his legs, avoiding my gaze as he leaned over to whisper to Richard and Sandra that they needed to vacate the conference room immediately before I followed through on my promise to file a massive countersuit for legal fees and emotional distress. I watched them stand up, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated, looking like ghosts who had finally realized they no longer haunted the halls of power. Sandra tried one last time to catch my eye, her silk handkerchief wadded into a damp, pathetic ball in her palm, but I was already looking past her at the digital display on my laptop, calculating the final closing costs of their era. As they shuffled out of the double glass doors of the 52nd floor, the silence they left behind was the most expensive and beautiful thing I had ever purchased. That evening, as the sun began to set over the Olympic Mountains, casting a bruised orange and violet glow across the Puget Sound, I sat in my private study and composed one final electronic communication to the people who had once shared my DNA. I didn't send a letter of forgiveness or a long-winded explanation of my pain because I had already processed those debts years ago on a cold porch in Southeast Portland. Instead, I attached a single high-resolution PDF to a brief, formal email, a permanent no trespass order that applied to all 12 of our commercial properties, our corporate headquarters, and my private residence. The document was a legal barricade, a digital fence that ensured the toxicity of Richard and Sandra Myers would never again leach into the soil of the life I had built with Uncle Harold. I hit the send button at exactly 6:14 p.m., the same minute they had told me 15 years ago that I was a line item they couldn't afford, and I felt the final tether of my past snap with a satisfying silent click. There was no anger left in me, only the profound, cooling relief of a ledger that had finally reached a perfect, unshakable balance of zero. Today, I sit in a home that is the literal antithesis of the cramped 1,200-square-foot house of my childhood. A modern architectural masterpiece in Madison Park that is filled with light, floor-to-ceiling glass, and the quiet hum of a life well managed. I am Diana Myers, and as the chief financial officer of this $23.7 million real estate empire, I have watched our portfolio grow by an unprecedented 34% under my tenure, a feat achieved through the same ruthless precision and attention to detail that I used to survive my adolescence. I manage assets, I negotiate mergers, and I decide which properties are worth the investment and which are simply liabilities to be offloaded to the highest bidder. My hands, once chapped from the industrial soaps of a Ballard car wash, now move across high-end keyboards and sign multi-million-dollar contracts with a gold-nibbed Montblanc pen that represents more wealth than my father ever saw in his entire miserable career. I have realized that the forest of my life could only thrive once I had the courage to take the saw to the toxic branch that was draining the nutrients from my soul. And while the cut was deep and painful at the time, the resulting growth has been nothing short of spectacular. Every morning I walk through my house, touching the cold marble of the countertops and the warm grain of the reclaimed wood floors, reminding myself that I am no longer the girl on the porch waiting for a ride that might never come. I am the owner of the house, the keeper of the keys, and the sole auditor of my own happiness. I think about the 19-year-old version of myself who drew 2 columns on a Starbucks napkin, them and me, and I realize that I have fulfilled every single promise I made to that girl in the back of Uncle Harold's Honda Civic. I have transformed the trauma of abandonment into a currency of independence, proving that family is not a biological mandate, but a strategic alliance built on mutual respect and shared value. My biological parents are likely still living in their cycle of debt and regret, perhaps even using those black garbage bags I suggested for their final move. But they are no longer my concern, because they are no longer on my balance sheet. I have learned that the greatest act of self-preservation is not forgiveness, but the absolute and total removal of those who refuse to see your worth until you have turned it into power. The light in my study is soft and golden as the day winds down, reflecting off the framed STEM scholarship certificate that Sandra once called a hobby, a document that now hangs in a place of honor next to my master's degree from the University of Washington. I have built a family of choice, a circle of professionals, mentors, and friends who value me for my intellect and my character rather than what I can provide for their vanity projects. I am the architect of a legacy that began in the ruins of a betrayal, and I carry the lessons of that June evening with me not as a burden, but as a blueprint for how to build something that lasts. I know the exact cost of a gallon of milk, the precise interest rate on a commercial bridge loan, and the invaluable price of my own peace of mind. I have moved from the periphery of other people's lives to the very center of my own, and the view from the 47th floor is even better when you know exactly how many stairs you had to climb to get there. The commercial properties I manage are more than just steel and glass. They are the physical manifestations of my resilience, each one a monument to a year I spent surviving the neglect of Richard and Sandra. When I walk through the lobby of our flagship building downtown, I don't see a line item. I see a fortress that I defended with everything I had. I have reached a point where the ghosts of the past no longer have the power to rattle the windows of my current reality, because I have replaced the old, drafty glass with something much stronger. I am the woman who holds the pen, The woman who writes the checks and the woman who finally knows that she was never an expense, but the most valuable asset in the entire world. The forest is safe, the toxic branches are gone, and the future is a wide, open landscape of potential that I intend to develop with the same relentless excellence that brought me here. As I look out over the city of Seattle, the lights beginning to twinkle like fallen stars across the hills, I feel a deep and abiding sense of gratitude for the man who saw a 13-year-old girl on a porch and decided she was worth the investment. Uncle Harold didn't just save me, he taught me how to save myself, and in doing so, he ensured that his own legacy would be managed by the only person who truly understood its value. I am the daughter he chose, and I am the professional he respected, a dual identity that is worth more than any sum on a bank statement. The story of the Myers family is no longer a tragedy of what was lost, but a triumph of what was built from the wreckage. I have balanced the books, closed the file, and for the first time in my life, I am operating in a world where the only debt I owe is to the woman I have become. The silence of my home is not the empty, frightening silence of the porch in southeast Portland, but the rich, full silence of a life that is completely under control. I have learned that you cannot fix people who are committed to their own dysfunction, but you can certainly outgrow them until they are nothing more than a speck in your rearview mirror. I have replaced the smell of cheap fish sticks and desperation with the scent of fresh lilies and success, a trade that I would make 1,000 times over if given the choice. I am no longer waiting for someone to open the door for me. I have built my own door, and it is made of solid, reinforced steel. The audit of my life is complete, the results are impeccable, and as I close my laptop for the night, I know that the most important number on any ledger is the number 1. The one person you have to be able to count on when the world turns cold. That person is me, and I am more than enough. In the final analysis, the line item they couldn't afford has become the foundation of an empire that will outlast their names and their memories. I have turned their rejection into my greatest strength, using the stones they threw at me to build the walls of my own sanctuary. I am Diana Myers, and I am finally, irrevocably, the owner of my own house, my own destiny, and my own name. The forest is quiet, the air is clear, and the future is mine to command. Family isn't blood. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I look at the empty chairs at the table I once longed to be part of, I realize that I am much happier sitting in the one I built for myself. The account is settled, the legacy is secure, and I am finally free to live in the light I created.